It's time for us to get started this morning. We are in Genesis chapter 39, and we're considering the story of Joseph in Egypt. Genesis chapter 39. All right, so we started the text on Thursday, but we had to talk about some kind of big picture stuff with Joseph. We talked about some of the technical terms that are used for officers and for high ministers in the ancient world, mainly because it helps us avoid confusion, like with Potiphar being a eunuch of Pharaoh. All of our English translations know he's not literally a eunuch, that eunuch is a technical term referring to an officer or a high minister of Pharaoh. He's captain of the guard, which translates chief of the butchers. We're going to see this crop up again as we get to chapter 40, in dealing with two other officers, two other high ministers of Pharaoh. We also spent some time talking about, and I think this is an important jumping off point for Joseph's story. We talked about how Joseph uses this word for God, Elohim. And it's not an uncommon word for God in the Old Testament. A lot of times it refers to capital G, God. All right, so there are possible translations here. Big G, God. It also can mean lowercase g, the gods. And we've talked about this possibility that Joseph's story at this point is not the story of his extraordinarily strong faith. And this is something that, at this point in the story, it's a possibility. When we get to the end of chapter 41, we're going to make the case that whenever Joseph is talking about Elohim, he's not talking about capital G God, he's talking about little g, the gods, and that he is a full-on pagan idolater. We're going to see, I think, what is some incontrovertible evidence of that at the end of chapter 41. At this point, we're just noting it as a possibility because as we continue through Joseph's story, we're going to see this crop up over and over again. The narration at the beginning of chapter 39 says, "Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord," is using the holy name of God, "the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. And he made him overseer of his house, and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate." All right, so in the narration, we consistently see the holy name of God being used. We're getting to see behind the scenes what's going on. It's God doing all of this. And again, it specifies this is the God of Israel, using the holy name. Joseph practically never uses that term for God, and it's something that's distinct. It should jump out at us. Joseph always uses Elohim. So as we read through, we're going to continue to notice this happening. We talked on Thursday about how we gave some early evidence for why it could be a possibility at this point, because we bear in mind who Joseph's mother was. Joseph's mother was Rachel, and what do we know about Rachel's faith? We'll just say it was spread far and wide. All right, she's the one that brought idols into Jacob's household, and Jacob was not particularly strong about that. He does not get rid of the idols until Genesis chapter 35, which we're not told time-wise precisely when that would have happened. But do y'all remember where Joseph was born? Where were all of Jacob's sons born except for Benjamin? They were born in Paddan Aram whenever Jacob was living with Laban, tending his flocks. So Joseph is born in Paddan Aram. And it's after his birth that that Jacob first decides that it's time to go. And if we go back, go back to Genesis chapter 30. Verse 22, Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son, and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, May the Lord add to me another son. All right, now this next bit should sound very, very familiar to us. As soon as Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, Send me away, that I may go to my own home and country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, that I may go. For you know the service that I have given you. But Laban said to him, If I have found favor in your sight, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages, and I will give it. This is where Laban and Jacob strike this deal about how Jacob is going to continue keeping Laban's flocks, but he's only going to receive certain colored kids and certain colored lambs as his wages. The black lambs, speckled and spotted goats, those will be Jacob's wages. By this time, Joseph is already born, and we know that Jacob sticks around for a while. But anyway, what's happening here should sound familiar to us because it's basically what we just read about Joseph in Potiphar's household. That Jacob, as he's living in Laban's household, he's a source of blessing for Laban. Right? And again, the holy name of God is used here. Except, we just read that Potiphar could see that the Lord was with Joseph. Here Laban tells us explicitly, I've learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. So you've got these two situations where Jacob and Joseph are both living in a land of affliction. They don't want to be there, but the Lord is blessing them and prospering them, and furthermore is blessing the household of their masters because of them. All right, but Joseph has been born by this point, and it's not until later, after Jacob has amassed great wealth, that he actually goes to leave. Jacob leaves, and does Jacob immediately go to Canaan? Well, no. He travels first to, he settles down east of the Jordan. He meets God. Remember, he wrestles with God in a place called Peniel. He settles in a place very close to Peniel called Sukkot, east of the Jordan River. Afterwards, he crosses the Jordan, but doesn't go down to Bethel where he's supposed to go. He goes to Shechem, right, which is where we find him in chapter 34. In other words, years pass by before finally, in chapter 35, God said to Jacob, Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, Put away the foreign gods that are among you and purify yourselves and change your garments. All right, so we don't know how many years have passed. If I had to estimate based on roughly the age of Dinah in chapter 34, which we estimated to be really young, like 14 maybe. Joseph is probably still a young kid at this point. but old enough to see what's going on. All right, again, you think about this, the circumstances in which he is raised. He is raised, at least in early childhood, as an idolater. And so it's not beyond the pale to say that Joseph, the son of Rachel, who was raised in his early childhood as an idolater, could be buying into this. Again, we're going to make the case, I think, incontrovertibly by the end of chapter 41 that he is buying into that. But it changes the way that we read the story if we acknowledge that that's a possibility in Joseph's mind. One of the things that we've got to be careful of as we're reading Joseph's story is that we want to read Daniel's righteousness into it. Right? Because those are the big parallels. Joseph and Daniel have very, very similar stories. Right? They're both taken captive into a foreign country. They are both put into situations of high influence because of the activity of God. Both of them interpret visions and dreams. And whenever we turn to Daniel, I want us to have this in mind as well as we read through Joseph. Turn to Daniel chapter 2. In Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar has this vision, and he refuses to, so he calls all of his wise men together, the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers, and he refuses to tell them the dream. He says, "You tell me the dream and its interpretation." And they all say, "No, that's impossible. That cannot be done." And Nebuchadnezzar says, "Okay, fine. Well, I'm going to kill all of you." And Daniel learns about this because Daniel's own head is on the line. And he asks Arioch, the king's captain, to give him some time, and that he will show the interpretation to the king. In verse 17, Daniel 2:17, "Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon." All right, so first thing Daniel does is he says, pray. And he doesn't just pray about it himself, he asks his companions to pray about it with him. All right, so we know that Daniel's praying about it. Then we're told explicitly in verse 19, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. All right, the narration here doesn't leave anything to doubt or speculation. Daniel received the interpretation in a vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. All right, and he's got this doxology that runs from verses 20 to 23. He goes into the king's captain and gets an appointment before the king. And if we go down to verse 26, the king declared to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, "Are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation?" Daniel answered the king and said, "No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in bed are these. To you, O king, as you lay in bed, came thoughts of what would be after this, and he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be. But as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be made known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind." All right, so over and over again, whenever Daniel is standing before Nebuchadnezzar, who does he give the glory to? He's constantly giving it to God, and he's explicit about it. He says, it's not because of my wisdom that this thing has been revealed to me. It's in order that the interpretation may be made known to the king. Right? It's the God of heaven who is doing this. All right, and we can read elsewhere in Daniel where he does similar things. Particularly by the time we get to Daniel 6 and Darius the Mede, well, why is Daniel thrown in the lion's den? Because he keeps praying to God, the God of Israel. And by the end of the chapter, whenever Daniel is delivered from the lion's den, and all of the other king's ministers, the ones that conspired against him, when they're found out, when they're caught, they're thrown into the lion's den. And do you remember the decree that Darius makes at the end of the chapter? He says, everybody has to honor Daniel's God. All right, it's explicit, it's clear to Darius the Mede that it's Daniel's God doing things. Just like in Daniel chapter 4, it's clear to Nebuchadnezzar, it's Daniel's God doing these things. Now, we want to read all of these details back into the Joseph story. As we read through, over these next several chapters, 39 through 41, pay attention to Joseph. Does he do the things that Daniel did? Do the people around him have the reactions that Nebuchadnezzar and Darius had? Is it clear to them that Joseph is extolling his God and not the gods of the Egyptians? Is it clear that Joseph is even extolling the gods and not himself? All right, so pay attention to those as we're reading through the text. Again, this is not the story of Joseph standing on great faith. This is the story of Joseph's descent. Because as we have seen in Genesis, all of the patriarchs start out rotten. And it's not until later in life that they experience any form of conversion. And often it's incomplete at that, as we just saw with Jacob. Okay, so I know a lot of catching up, but it's really, really important for us to have that in mind as we go into the story. All right, let's pray together, and we'll jump back into our text in Genesis 39. Our Father in heaven, thank you for the great blessings that you have given us today. Thank you for our time together to study from your word. Father, we recognize your faithfulness in the things that we read. We recognize that you are the one acting behind the scenes to accomplish your will. And Father, I pray that you grant us the righteousness and the wisdom, to acknowledge you in everything that happens, and to recognize that you are King of kings and Lord of lords. Righteous Father, thank you for saving us from our affliction. Thank you, Father, for saving us from our own sins through the work of your Son, Jesus of Nazareth. I pray, Father, that you make us more faithful in his kingdom. Help us to be more like him each day. It's in his name that we pray. Amen. All right, so Genesis 39. Let's start at the end of verse 6. All right, so at the beginning of the verse, we read that Potiphar has left all that he has in Joseph's charge. Because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food that he ate. At the end of the verse, we are told, but Joseph was handsome in form and in appearance, which in Genesis so far has been a pretty ominous description. Being good-looking isn't all it's cut out to be, at least not in the book of Genesis. Think of who else has been good-looking in form and appearance. And these, we kind of separate based on gender. Handsome is for the fellas and beautiful is for the ladies. That distinction is not quite present in the Hebrew. Who else have we read of in Genesis that you can think of who's really, really good-looking? Rachel. Yeah, where do you think Joseph gets it from? If Moses uses the same words here, right? That now is whenever we see this description of Rachel, how do things turn out? Does that turn out well? No, it's a complete disaster for Jacob on all sorts of levels in ways that he doesn't understand. All right, but it cues us in. All right, something bad's about to happen. Or even going all the way back to Genesis chapter 12. Sarah was described this way. Yes. This is, by the way, almost exactly the same situation, just with some of the genders reversed. Genesis 12:11, when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai his wife, "I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance." It's the same description that is translated handsome in form or handsome in appearance later on. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, "This is his wife." Then they will kill me, but they'll let you live. Say that you're my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. All right, so the description cues us into, Sarah's about to be taken advantage of. And here in Genesis 39, this is exactly what happens. Yeah, Wayne?
Well, even springing forward, you go to David and Bathsheba. You go to Absalom.
Yeah.
And what happens with him?
Yeah, like Amnon and Tamar?
Yeah. It's just always seems like anybody's handsome, anybody's beautiful.
Yes. Yes, this is it. Anytime you see somebody, if God were to ever say to you, "Hey, you're handsome in form and appearance, but you better turn and run." All right, that's just the way it plays out in the Scriptures. After a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against," and here's the first test case here, "sin against either God or sin against the gods?" All right, and again, here we're looking at it as an option. It could be that Joseph is being very faithful here. That he is standing up to Mrs. Potiphar on principle, that he is saying, no, it would be wrong, it would be a sin against my God for me to lie with you. All right, that's option one, the Joseph is super faithful option. Option two is essentially that Joseph is being really pragmatic here, because what position is Joseph in? Well, is Joseph in a good position? Well, yes and no. He's overseer of Potiphar's house, but what is his status? What is his class? He's a slave. All right, and this puts him in a vulnerable position. He enjoys a lot of freedom and a lot of influence, a lot of power even, but he is still a member of the slave class, which is why Potiphar's wife can feel comfortable with just saying to him, "Lie with me." Right? It's an expectation in the ancient world. Your servants are your property, and you can do with them as you please. And so of course, she's going to be blunt about it. And Joseph, well, let's just say in the ancient world, for a low-class citizen to have relations, to commit adultery with a married high-class woman let's say by the end of the chapter, Joseph is lucky to be thrown into prison. It could have gone much worse for him. In a lot of instances, the law can prescribe death. In a lot of instances, the law can prescribe various tortures. Excuse me, depending on where you're living. Not talking about the law of Moses, but ancient laws of the land at the time. So Joseph could be standing on principle, or he could recognize that, hey, this is just really a stupid idea. If I get caught doing this, I'm toast. All right, so she spoke to Joseph day after day. He would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. There's a little bit of irony here. So we're at the beginning of chapter 37. With that second vision, Joseph keeps pestering his brothers and his father. He keeps telling them the vision. Here, Mrs. Potiphar keeps keeps propositioning Joseph. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand, and fled, and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand, and had fled outside of the house, she called to the men of her household, and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house." Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house." Excuse me. So Mrs. Potiphar manages to catch Joseph alone. And let me take just a bit of an aside here. This is not something that I think is necessarily intended in the text. But let's just take a moment to say a good word about the Pence rule. You know what I'm talking about? Mike Pence's standard that, like, you'd never be alone in a room with a member of the opposite sex. It's wise. All right, there's a reason why the vice president has never been the victim of some kind of scandal of that nature. And you see what happens to Joseph here. Again, he didn't have the benefit of Vice President Mike Pence in his life. But you see what happens. So she caught him by the garment. He left his garment. Yeah, Wayne?
Sorry, I interrupted you.
Go for it. No.
I'm confused.
Okay.
It says, verse 14, "See, he has brought among us the Hebrew." Who's
Yes.
the antecedent of he there? It seems like to me that she's
Potiphar.
blaming her husband,
Yeah.
Potiphar, and blaming him for doing something that, she's not.
Right. And she lays that accusation before him whenever he comes in. You have brought in, let's see, the Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me.
Okay, I just want to clarify that, because it looked like it's almost, he was saying, well, that is Joseph.
Oh, okay. Talking about Potiphar.
Yeah, it doesn't name it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pronoun. And so you kind of
Right.
confuse between pronouns. He,
Yeah.
He, well, who's he?
Yeah. That happens a lot in the scriptures.
I just want to know. Thank you.
Yeah. So Joseph leaves his garment behind, and this is, of course, proof of his presence. There's a reason why she lays this garment up next to her all day until Potiphar comes home, so that she can say, "Hey, look, this Hebrew servant has been here, and look what he's tried to do to me." Look at the way that Mrs. Potiphar reacts after Joseph flees. She calls to the men of her household. By the way, just keep track of how many times we see something like called or cried out or loud voice. She called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house." All right, and then she tells Potiphar the same thing. "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to laugh at me, but as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house." Mrs. Potiphar is being rather ham-fisted about this, because this is something that when we were studying in Genesis 34, and what happens to Dinah in the city of Shechem. We went over the statutes concerning sexual sins in Deuteronomy 22. And there's a distinction made. If you go to Deuteronomy 22:22, if a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman and the woman. So shall you purge evil from Israel. If there is a betrothed virgin, and a man meets her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death with stones. The young woman, because she did not cry out for help, though she was in the city. And the man, because he violated his neighbor's wife. So shall you purge the evil from your midst. But if in the open country a man meets a young woman who is betrothed, and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. You shall do nothing to the young woman. She has committed no offense punishable by death. For this case is like that of a man attacking and murdering his neighbor, because he met her in the open country, and though the betrothed young woman cried for help, there was no one to rescue her. All right, one of the big distinctions in the law of Moses and in other ancient laws between rape and adultery is the report. All right, if you're asking, all right, this situation happened, is the woman a victim, or is she a co-conspirator, co-criminal in this act? One of the big distinguishing marks is the presence or absence of a report. Right? If the woman brings a report, if she's crying out, that's piece of evidence number one that this is a rape that we're talking about. If she does not cry out, like we talked about in verses 23 and 24, then the assumption is, well, it must be consensual, what's going on. Right, and again, this is not just the law of Moses, it's also common in other places in the ancient world. And notice what Mrs. Potiphar is doing. She is crying out to beat the band. And she's letting people know that she is crying out. Right? Not only is she crying out, she is crying out about crying out. So, see, I'm reporting, I'm crying out. Whenever he heard me cry out with a loud voice, he left.
But did she cry out before?
Well, that's the thing, is she's faking this, right? She's setting him up. She's got the evidence, and now all she has to do is give the report. Whenever you also factor in their difference in status, that she's mistress of the house and he is a slave, then that's it. Joseph is done. He has no chance. So, as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And there he was in prison. But, and here, notice the narration returns to using the holy name of God. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it successful. All right, so we've got basically the same situation repeated over again. Joseph he's brought down lower. His status goes from slave to prisoner. But even in his low status, the Lord is with him. The Lord is keeping him, prospering him. And because of that, he is put in a high position within his status. And we've even got some of the same descriptions going on. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was done in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. Similar to Potiphar. Potiphar didn't pay any attention to anything except what he happened to be eating at the time. Right? That's how unconcerned he was, how much trust he put in Joseph. The only thing he cares about is what he's shoveling into his face at the moment. Keeper of the prison is the same way. He does not care, does not worry about anything that's going on in the prison. Let's see, there's something I need to look up real quick that just occurred to me. Let me see if we've got... yeah, we do. Okay. Remember this in verse 21. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. This is a very, very common word in the Old Testament, chesed, which means loving kindness or steadfast love. It's the one that you read over and over again, if I remember right, in Psalm 136. The steadfast love of the Lord endures forever. The one that the psalmist uses like every other line. Pay attention to that word because we're going to see it again in chapter 40. And I tell you, we've got just enough time to read the chapter and make some initial observations on it. Any questions or comments on chapter 39? Okay, so chapter 40. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in his custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled, or that they were haggard. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations," and here's another instance here, "do not interpretations belong to God? Or do not interpretations belong to the gods?" Either way, Joseph's response here should send up a red flag to us. "Please tell them to me." So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in his hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. And you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness, the chesed, to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, "I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked goods for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head." And Joseph answered and said, "This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you." And on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Okay. First thing, just to tie things back to chapter 39. At the end of the chapter, we're told that the Lord was with Joseph, that the Lord showed Joseph chesed, steadfast love, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Now in chapter 40, where is Joseph looking for steadfast love? Where does he expect to find chesed? From the Lord? Or from whom? Who does he ask, "Please show me your steadfast love"? It's the cupbearer. When you're restored to your position, in verse 14, only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the chesed to mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. All right, we know behind the scenes that the real loving kindness that is driving Joseph's story and that is bringing him success is God's loving kindness, the loving kindness of the Lord. Joseph doesn't appeal to God here. He appeals to the cupbearer. The only appeal that he makes to God, possibly at all in this instance, is in verse 8. Now, you remember when we read earlier in Daniel chapter 2, how explicit was Daniel about attributing things to God? I mean, how unambiguous was he about it? Did Daniel leave any doubt in our minds? And he even went to the extent to say, it's not by my wisdom. I'm not the one doing this. I'm not different from any other man. It's only so that the interpretation can be known to the king. Right? The God of heaven is doing this. In fact, he also uses the word Most High, right, which is another common name for God in the Old Testament, El Shaddai, God Most High. We see the Most High in this passage in chapter 40, but it's not from Joseph. Joseph does not invoke the Shaddai, the Most High. This is, and I think maybe Daniel is doing this at Joseph's expense whenever we read Shaddai in Daniel. In Joseph's story, we read it in the vision of the baker. I also had a dream, verse 16. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the Most High basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. So the only time that we see that invoked, it's not meant to be any sort of title for God at all. Again, the only possible place where Joseph might be invoking the God of Israel is in verse 8. And again, we've said the option is it could be do not interpretations belong to God, do not interpretations belong to the gods. But look at the way that Joseph frames this. And as we look at this, bear in mind the way that Joseph has dealt with other people up to this point. Is Joseph generally full of himself? We've seen that plenty. In Genesis 37, he is absolutely full of himself. Yes?
Also, he hasn't seen his dreams come to pass yet from his brothers that he interpreted.
Right.
They're still in limbo there.
Yes. Yeah. Now, and ultimately we know because, again, God through Moses has been telling us this, that behind the scenes God is working all of this out. Right, we get to see behind the scenes. It's what we call a dramatic irony. We see what's going on. The actual people in the midst of the story do not get to see everything that we get to see. And we get to see how much of it they understand. For example, with Abraham's servant back in Genesis 24, right, we get Moses' narration of what happens, and we get the servant's description of what happens, and they're exactly the same. It's like reading the same story twice over, because the servant gets it. We see what's going on behind the scenes, and then we see that the servant understands what's going on behind the scenes, because he's faithful. Joseph, we are told, we're told what's going on behind the scenes. At no point, up to this point, has Joseph attributed any of that to the Lord God of Israel. But look at this again here in chapter 40 and verse 8. I think this will be our last observation for this morning. All right, they said to him, "We've had dreams. There is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." Now, Again, it's left ambiguous enough that we can read all kinds of things into it. That's the thing that we have to understand about Joseph, is that whatever we think about Joseph, at this point we have to read into Joseph. In Daniel, it is left unambiguous that Daniel is righteous and he's attributing everything to God. In Joseph, if we already think he's faithful, we just kind of understand this to mean, don't interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me and God will explain it to me. Right? God will make sure that the interpretation gets to you. Joseph doesn't actually say that, but that's a possible way to interpret it, that Joseph means that God will give him the interpretation to give to them. We could just as well interpret this as, do not interpretations belong to the gods? Please tell them to me, as in, what is Joseph claiming for himself? That he's of some sort of divine status. Again, at this point, anything that we want to say about it, we have to read in. This question will be settled for us by the end of chapter 41. But like I've already said, this is the spoiler. By the end of chapter 41, Joseph is going to be shown incontrovertibly to be an Egyptian idolater. And so at this point, we should get comfortable with the idea that Joseph is claiming divinity for himself in the prison. And that while things are working out in the background, that the Lord is working things out in the background, Joseph is completely fooled. He has fooled himself about what's going on. Because whenever these things actually come true, again, if Joseph is faithful, it's going to confirm his belief in God. If Joseph is faithless, if he's an idolater, and if he's so full of himself that he thinks that he has the power of the gods, then these visions coming true is just going to confirm what he already thinks. All right, so we'll continue chapter 40 on Thursday. And there's not a whole lot more to cover in chapter 40, honestly. We'll probably jump also into chapter 41. Keith?
Just further proves that God rules in the kingdoms of men.
Yes.
Even the pagan kingdoms.
Absolutely. And yeah, the whole, the background scene, the thread that's going through all of this story is that Joseph thinks that he's in control of things and that he is somehow really special and has been put into this position. But ultimately, we know that it's God who is doing this. And just like with Jacob, God eventually is going to step into Joseph's life and assert himself undeniably. Remember what it took for Jacob. It took a wrestling match. All right, we'll see what it takes for Joseph. Thank you so much for your questions and comments and your kind attention this morning.